here's a man that is dying, that is having success with his physician prescribed psilocybin, and for whatever reason, Health Canada cut him off, and now he had to travel to the Caribbean to access his care. Well, this doesn't make sense.
I'm a historian and a Canada Research Chair in the history of health and social justice at the University of Saskatchewan, and I've been looking into the history of psychedelics, including psilocybin, for, embarrassingly now, I think it's getting up over 25 years. Wow. So enough time that the conversation has changed rather dramatically from something that kind of people teased me about or, giggled about in corners to a really open conversation that draws on this history in different new ways. Do you want me to say a little bit about how I got started? Or?
Yes, absolutely. I'll share how I got into it as well after you. But
it was a Tool concert. No, just
yeah.
It's funny. A number of people ask me, and especially more recently, they ask me, if I had just taken a lot of mushrooms or if I was, really interested in that side of it. And it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, I didn't come into this with an interest in the recreational side. I was really drawn to this history. I was working for a historian of science who was interested in how psychedelics, so including psilocybin, but also LSD and mescaline from the peyote cactus, how these were substances that were experimented upon in the 1950s in the context of psychiatry. I started that research probably in the 1990s, actually, when I was working for somebody else. And then I went off to school and took this project with me into a PhD program at McMaster University in, I think it was 2000 or 2001. And, it kind of plunged me into this really fascinating story about the way that these substances that, have this kind of recreational appeal, but they also have deep indigenous roots, and they also have this way of changing one's perspective on themselves. And we see this, you might imagine it, or some people often imagine it as like, oh, it'll make the music sound more groovy or something like that. But I think there's something much more serious that lies behind them, particularly with the idea that some of these substances, and psilocybin is one of the leading ones, can change the way you see yourself, your behaviors, your relationships, and this can have profound therapeutic benefits.
Roughly 3 years ago, Thomas Hartle came into my office, and I understand that you worked with him at the time on some advocacy work, and Thomas was, for the viewers, he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, had months to live, and everyone has someone that has fought cancer in their life, either a family or a friend, and it's a common story where the anxiety and your mental state is not the easiest when you hear you will be dying in 4 months. And Thomas's experience was his anxiety went off the charts, and his physician couldn't treat his cancer. And this is Thomas telling me, is because his mind was all over the place. So they prescribed psilocybin with counseling. And in Canada, as you know, is that you have to get it through, the legal stuff is through Health Canada, through the Special Access Program. And Thomas was successful in filling out the paperwork and waiting his time, and they got back to him. They granted him access to legal psilocybin. And with counseling, it calmed his mind so that his body could fight cancer. And it was working. Until the bureaucrats with Health Canada shut him down roughly at the 4-year mark of his journey. And that's when he came to see his member of parliament, myself. And, I knew about magic mushrooms and psilocybin cursory, but I didn't think that much of it as medicine. And I took it on, and I'm like, well, this doesn't make sense. Like, here's a man that is dying, that is having success with his physician prescribed psilocybin, and for whatever reason, Health Canada cut him off, and now he had to travel to the Caribbean to access his care. And I started looking into this a little bit more and meeting other people, similar stories than as Thomas shared with me. And then I met, people that had serious addiction issues, opioid addiction issues, that they were able to get clean and stay clean with the help of psilocybin counseling. And then you meet some of the veterans that are out there that have struggled so much with PTSD, and that they're claiming that they got off the bottle and they can access some of the memories of what caused that trauma. And over the last 3 years, I kept meeting more and more patients, then meeting more researchers and physicians, and this is kind of where your name kept popping up. And you're in my city of Saskatoon and have a reach, obviously across Canada, but internationally as well, on the go-to person about psilocybin and psychedelics. And then kind of connecting the dots with our province. Back in the 50s, we were cutting edge work out of Weyburn that was shut down, unfortunately. And we've been kind of in this little bit of a pause for the longest time on research. But now there's a ton of research being done right now and being published that is very exciting that, potentially we are facing an epidemic of mental health and addiction crisis across Canada. And one of the solutions, I believe, is psilocybin with counseling. Your physician can't prescribe this medicine that has been shown in the patients that I've met with that had fabulous responses to.
Yeah. And I think it may even go a little bit deeper than that, in that physicians are hard-pressed to find educational programs that cater to this kind of knowledge as well. And again, I think more and more patients are coming into clinics asking for this kind of information. And unless you have a physician who's willing to take that on him or herself, it's very difficult to meet patients where they're at. And so, again, it kind of pushes them into this underground supply, which I think you're absolutely right. Not that there's a clear map of it or something, but it's clear that you can source these substances and others. And I think that kind of moves us into risky territory where people, perhaps with good intentions and often desperate for change, are looking for solutions that introduce a new set of risks and may ultimately make it even more difficult to regulate these substances safely if we don't get ahead of that. In the 1950s, early 60s, there were a number of focused research studies that tried to demonstrate exactly that. And they did this across a variety of things, whether it was, some mushrooms, or whether you could take extracts from mushrooms. You have to have the whole mushroom. And, all of these studies ended up sort of concluding rather convincingly that indeed, just as you suggest, that, these were not toxic. These are not addictive. Now, this is not to say that all psychedelics fall into that category, because there are other substances that get called psychedelics. So just to be fair, and often also these products are sometimes mixed with other things. So if some storefronts are selling them in different ways. So I think this is another point about the regulation is that yes, under ideal circumstances, taken in a pure sense, those were what the studies showed for a long time. That information went right up to the UN when they were making their schedule of drugs in the 1970s. And there too, there was a desire to go into Indigenous communities that had even, more than a decade of research on this, but had, millennia kind of experiences and oral history to draw from. And there too, there was a profound sense that these substances were way less harmful. You may have seen in the news, I think this was about 2007 or so, there was a British psychopharmacologist who was working for the sort of British arm of the FDA, and he made this very claim and was promptly sacked from his position and went off to study this as a neuroscientist. His name is David Nutt, if anybody wants to check my sources. Yeah. But he was very adamant that actually things like riding horses could cause more head trauma. Like if you fell off a horse, you'd have more head trauma than taking massive and repeat doses of psilocybin. Wow. So it's claims like this that sometimes get kind of turned into sound bites, but the research has backed it up to show that these are relatively safe compounds, particularly when we compare them with smoking ketamine, or alcohol, ketamine, heroin, opioids. Many of the things that are even prescribed as medicines.
What did you find out when you were researching the Weyburn Hospital and some of the breakthroughs that they were able to pioneer?
Oh, so many things. This takes me back. I was really fortunate that I began my research in the early 2000s when a number of the people who had worked in the Weyburn facility and other places in Saskatchewan, including here in Saskatoon, were still alive. And so I was able to interview some of them directly. That included patients, nurses, social workers, and psychiatrists themselves. And, as I mentioned before, the conversation has changed so much that I was really fortunate that people were open and candid with me about the experiences, but also they were kind of living in the prohibition moment when it was almost taboo to talk about psychedelics. But, despite that prohibition and despite there being definitely a kind of air of concern that overlaid all of this, some of them were concerned that their legacy, their reputations as psychiatrists, for example, was going to be tarnished by continually being associated with psychedelics, whereas today we might think of that differently. But the word psychedelic itself was coined here in Saskatchewan. Humphrey Osmond, the British trained psychiatrist, came to be the superintendent of the psychiatric hospital in Weyburn. We were told there was the largest asylum in the Western world at the time. The largest asylum in the British Commonwealth, which I don't know if that's true, but certainly that was one of its claims to fame. It was grossly overcrowded, like many asylums, and it was Osmond who came up with this idea, to fall in hell or soar angelic, you'll need a pinch of psychedelic. That was through his correspondence with Aldous Huxley. But he did so it's clever and maybe cute even, but he was really interested in what was happening to these patients who were languishing in these old-style asylum hospitals. He said, we seem to have lost touch with them. They had often been sort of isolated and lost touch with their families and communities. And, it was really difficult to even communicate with them. And about 70% of the patients in that facility, much like many across Canada, were suffering from some kind of psychotic disorder. Today we might have said it's schizophrenia, or we might have had precise language for it. But these are people who experienced hallucinations or delusions, so hearing voices is the most common experience. And what Osmond felt was that initially, by taking, in his case, LSD or mescaline, those were the two substances available to him at that time, he could empathize with his patients. And it wasn't initially that they conceptualized this as a treatment so much as it was a way for staff to appreciate how people were experiencing reality in a way that could help them, lower their beds so that they didn't dangle their feet off the edges of their beds and feel that they were falling instead of staying in their rooms like, they were being reclusive or something, that this was actually a really simple feature that you could change. Here we're sitting in the office tower of the University of Saskatchewan. It was built probably around the same time as some of the hospitals. You'll notice that there's stripes in the floor. Well, they found that if you were having depth perception changes, you might perceive those lines not to be, tiles in the floor, but rather negative space, like a hole. Mm-hmm. So maybe you wouldn't want to cross the line. And this would stop someone from engaging in therapy or engaging in that kind of work. So initially, this was a really profound insight that it would allow you to just generate some empathy with someone you felt very distant from, that harsh kind of doctor-patient relationship. But very quickly, they found that some of the things that staff were experiencing, insight into their own behavior, insight into themselves, was actually itself therapeutic. And they first started working with patients who came in for problem drinking. There was sort of, before alcoholism was even really a firm term. And they had tremendous results. 80 to 90% of the people they treated using one dose, sometimes two doses, but not daily doses, with therapy, were able to return to their families, were able to leave the hospital. Many gained employment again. And these were really profound transformations in people's trajectories. People who were often kind of written off for decades in a hospital setting. And now they were returning to the workforce, they were returning to their communities in really, in these ways that really transformed what was possible with psychiatric intervention.
That's kind of the conversation I had with a former opioid addict. And he explained it that way, that it wasn't actually what got him off the opioids, but it got him to stay off the opioids. Yeah. So that's where a lot of our addiction protocols out there, you can have early short-term success, but an addict will come back. Yeah. Versus some of the treatments that I've been researching, some of the papers I've read, it's more that it helps the addict once they break that cycle. They can't be on the substance before benefiting from psilocybin therapy, but that therapy will cause the initial counseling that they had to get off their substance that much more effectively. And we see this every day. Any major city in Canada, you go down, and the compassionate thing is to find treatment for these people. People I always say that mental health and addictions are two sides of the same coin. One will cause the other, and vice versa. Where if we can break that cycle, and maybe psilocybin is that key that we've been missing for whatever reason for all these years,
Yeah.
and it's right there for the benefit of our society.
There was a clinic in New Westminster in BC. They concentrated on this from the late 1950s through into the 70s when it was closed down. And here they also really focused on dealing with people with addictions. And the language is a little bit different in that time period, but I think for today's purposes, what they were dealing with was something that, we would recognize as addictions today, primarily alcohol in that case. And again, these amazing stories of people who didn't necessarily feel many other interventions were, to make alcohol taste bad or something, or, give you like a really, really bad hangover so that you would not want to do it again, right? And those have some effect, and certainly some people have benefited from that or turned around on that. But this operated in a really different way. So here they were using psilocybin not to, cast judgment or make you feel guilty about the drinking necessarily, but to sort of get you to go inward. Often people describe this in very spiritual terms, and with a whole diversity of ways that people engage in spirituality. It wasn't a particular Christian message or something like that, but people would feel kind of humbled in the presence of this experience, such that they were deferring to, like, there is a bigger world out there than my ego, or and so you can imagine different therapists running with that language. But this idea that you could embrace the psilocybin experience as a way of wanting to desire or generating your own willpower to do something different, not just to avoid it, but to really appreciate why you were doing it in the first place. And that's something that therapists were describing as the equivalent of about 10 years of psychotherapy with someone who was off a substance. And here you combined all of that in one often kind of like whopping, powerful experience, which therefore required subsequent psychotherapy, because that's quite a truckload of experiences to unpack in an 8-hour session.
So roughly 6 years ago, they were approving 88%. Through order question, we're down to below 30% now that are getting approved through Health Canada. Over 200 patients and physicians have gone to the courts to get Health Canada to reverse their order. And as soon as, and they've been all 100% successful, and as once Health Canada appeals the court, this is going to go to the Supreme Court for a hearing, hopefully, and that will force governments to respond. But on your comment about end-of-life care, that's the part that makes, it's probably the part that is the most frustrating for some of these patients, where they are literally dying. There is this individual called Pistol Pete. He's in Ontario, and I got to met his son, and I've done a little bit of research about Pete's life and what he's experiencing. It's terminal. It's not cancer, but it's a respiratory condition that he has that he will die from. And Health Canada took 11 months to get back to him to say, no, you're not dying quick enough or painfully enough that we will not grant you the ability to have a plant, being psilocybin, which is very, very frustrating. That I think is wrong for our society. If there's peace that can come from having this medicine, versus the alternative, such as his son told me that he could have easily got him on MAID in the morning and had the procedure in the afternoon. Meanwhile, we have a natural product that's non-toxic, non-addictive, that doctors are wanting to prescribe for end-of-life care, and Health Canada is saying nope. Or what's even worse is they're taking 11 months to get back to some of these people that are literally dying, and trying to find just a calm and easing of anxiety is how Pistol Pete's family explained. And I think everybody has had a loved one that perhaps that have died on you. It's a tough time, and if that person that is terminal has a way to calm that anxiety and give them a little bit of peace, I think it's on us as a society to grant those dying individuals that wish.
I think it's especially interesting with Canada's role in, in bringing out the MAID program at the same time that, the access to psilocybin has not been made available. It struck me as it could have been a good opportunity to open up these things together, because I know, these are highly controversial topics, and I know there's lots of different ways of talking about this. But I do think as a society, if we're going to open up opportunities for, different ways of end-of-life management, pain management, it is something that needs to be on the agenda, or should be on the agenda. And it's fascinating. I know that when the special access program, prior to the special access program, when Section 56 exemptions were still being granted, the majority of those, until it moved over to special access, the majority of those were for end-of-life anxiety. And I had the privilege of meeting with some of those patients, and have met with some of the patients in other jurisdictions as well. And you're right. I mean, no one thinks it's going to, cure their cancer, and these are mostly patients in oncology. And yet, remarkably, and like in a stunning way that defies logic, many of them outlive their prognosis. And again, the cancer didn't, suddenly disappear, but the change in outlook on life was remarkable. We also had the privilege of working with some of the families who are also, they're dealing with a kind of end-of-life care that is also often unknown to them at the time. And of course, Thomas Hartle really comes to mind here as, a real champion of this, but also someone who just really sort of came in with his eyes wide open and just did a tremendous amount of research on his own to find out what his options were, and that's what led him to you as well. And you saw the changes for his family. He was worried about his children and how he would even talk to them with this very sort of constrained diagnosis. And he ended up, with many extra years.
Yeah.
And I think, it's something that I'm sure that anyone, when faced with that opportunity, would want to see that gift granted. And it's hard not to be a little bit passionate and emotional about these moments, particularly when you work with patients on the front lines, even as a doctor, PhD, even as a historian. It's a real privilege to be able to share those stories and carry those stories.
Well, he sparked something with me, and it was the first conversation with someone that had benefited from psilocybin counseling. But some of the veteran stories are just horrific and moving as well, where we're giving seemingly this substance is giving people their lives back.
Yeah.
So that is why I'm working as hard as I can to change the regulation in Canada on psilocybin. But we're not alone. And around the world, just recently, Australia has had a move that I think Saskatchewan or Canada could copy. There's other states in America that have gone down a different path. But there is acceptance in Germany, apparently, and Switzerland as well. These are countries that are, some of them are G7 allies here that are confident enough that the science is there, that we should be allowing physicians the ability to prescribe to their patients. Yeah. And I think that's what's empowering me right now.
Yeah, I do think that there's a sea change afoot. We've moved past a kind of war on drugs mentality when we put certain drugs in a category of, that they're not medically useful, that they might be highly addictive. And I think we've moved past that both through the science, but also with maybe a different appreciation for what these substances can do for us in certain circumstances, that it's not, time to put them in the water supply as was allegedly threatened in the past. Yeah. But that, under careful scrutiny and in the right hands and taken with care, these are powerful medicines that have real potential. And I mean, maybe this is a silly point to bring up, but they might even be really cost effective.
Yes.
It's something that I often sort of struggle with is, there's so many things that kind of line up to make sense here that, again, with noted cautions, but these are really cost-effective ways of bringing people back into alignment with their lives and their families, and yeah. And
it's not all about money, but our healthcare system is so slanted to patented molecules. So if you can patent the molecule, you can have the business case to bring forward some large phase 3 trials. And that is our system, that we don't grant access to new medicines until we've had very vigorous and large-scale trials, which I support. But the truth of the matter is, because the molecule can't be patented, the business case isn't there. But that's about to change, because, as you're probably aware, just as I've heard from veterans that have had success with psilocybin counseling, American veterans have had also the same success. And the U.S. government has paid for 3 large phase 3 trials that are going to be published this year, which should have a definitive answer on the question of how effective psilocybin is, which is an exciting time to be working on psilocybin, because knowing that as much as there's a mountain of science out there that has shown that these are safe and effective treatments, without that business model that is so slanted to big pharma, you talk about savings. Well, think about how many people are on an antidepressant once a day. And there is going to be a sea change if the patients that I've met with, and the people that you've interviewed as well, bear out to be true for our population that are struggling with mental health and addiction problems. This could be the solution that actually saves our healthcare system in Canada. And America's going to do whatever they're going to do down there. I think we need to strike our own path as a country, and we can follow or be joined with other G7 countries like Australia that has a system where the physician are trained. They are able to prescribe psilocybin where it makes sense in their practice, and we're going to get there. I do believe that we're going to get there, and I would like to thank you, Erika, for so much for your time today, and for some of the research you've done that is helping me in my work, because we talked about Thomas, but Thomas is the reason why I'm here today, is because of that one story. But that, just like maybe in other people's lives, you get put on a path by one story or one direction, and then you meet other people, and that has led me to where I am with understanding of why psilocybin is such an important medicine for our system. But it allows me to meet great people like yourself. And thank you for your past work, and thank you for sitting down with me today.
Thanks for having me.